He was a billionaire who never lost control. Every deal, every room, every person, all moved when he decided. Until one night, in the most luxurious restaurant in Manhattan, he smelled a familiar scent, vanilla and cinnamon. His heart stopped, because the woman carrying that scent was the one he abandoned. His ex-wife. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked past him like he didn't exist, wearing a waitress uniform and carrying a child that could only be his. In that moment, Xavier Garcia realized something terrifying. He hadn't just lost a woman. He may have lost a family. And this time, money couldn't fix it. At Celeste, Manhattan's temple of fine dining, the chandeliers weren't just lights. They were captive galaxies dripping with crystal fire. Their brilliance streaked across the vast, polished marble floors, catching the edges of silk-laden tables and reflecting in the towering arched windows that showcased the city's glittering, sleepless sprawl. The waitstaff moved with a silent, spectral grace in their crisp attire, trays held with impossible steadiness, their movements a counterpoint to the low melody of a grand piano and the discreet murmur of powerful people. This was the stage for the global elite, a place where dinner was less about food and more about performance. Fortunes were brokered over the sparkle of champagne. Love was appraised with the rarity of a fine vintage. Even power felt like a tangible presence, woven into the fine threads of the tablecloths. A table here wasn't a luxury, it was a statement of arrival. And at 42, Xavier Garcia, one of New York's most dominant figures in real estate, was an essential part of that grand performance. At least, he played the part impeccably. He entered with a measured, unhurried pace, the walk of a man whose empire had reshaped the city's very foundations. A bespoke suit the color of a midnight sky draped his tall frame, a subtle testament to both his authority and his wealth. The silver of his cufflinks flashed with each turn of his wrist, quiet signals that commanded respect without a single word. His hair, a distinguished mix of salt and pepper, was perfectly coiffed. Only a shadow of deep-seated weariness around his eyes betrayed what no amount of grooming could conceal. The maitre d', a man who seated world leaders and Hollywood royalty, immediately stood taller. "Mr. Garcia," he acknowledged with a smooth deference. "Your regular table in the corner, I presume." Xavier nodded, a gesture honed to perfection in countless boardrooms and grand galas across the globe. "Good evening, Julian. That would be perfect. And still water for me. I believe my guest will arrive shortly." A flicker of surprise crossed Julian's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. He was a professional whose job was to facilitate, not to inquire. "Of course, sir." And with that, Xavier was guided through the sparkling labyrinth of diners toward the restaurant's most secluded alcove, a spot favored by those who traded in influence, empires, and secrets. He passed by smiles engineered for public display, past a titan of finance whispering intently to a senator, past a woman whose diamonds cascaded down her neck like frozen starlight. He belonged here. This was his world. And yet, surrounded by the familiar glow of success and the quiet thrum of Manhattan's ambition, Xavier felt a strange sense of disquiet. He adjusted his cufflink, a tell honed over years of high-stakes deals, a small ritual he performed when his thoughts became turbulent. His phone vibrated once. A message lit up the lock screen. Running 10 minutes late, the meeting was endless. Wait until you see my new red dress. V. Victoria Clean, his companion of the moment. A woman the press fawned over stunning, with a sharp, strategic elegance that made her the ideal accessory to his public persona. They were a fixture at every major charity ball, their partnership a popular topic in the gossip columns. It was a tidy, well-balanced arrangement. Xavier replied, "I look forward to it." He placed his phone face down, took a sip from his water glass, and inhaled deeply. But the usual ambient hum of the restaurant, which normally felt like a comforting symphony, sounded jarring and empty to him tonight. The sound of laughter bounced around the room, feeling like it belonged to a different lifetime, one he was no longer a part of. And then it hit him. A delicate, yet unmistakable scent drifted through the air, warm vanilla with a hint of cinnamon. It wasn't coming from the kitchen. Celeste's chefs didn't craft dishes with that kind of warmth. This was personal. It was a scent born from memory, not from a menu. It struck him like a forgotten melody, a single note that vibrated through his very soul. Ella. Her name surfaced from the depths of his mind before he could push it back down. Ella Thompson. The woman he'd once called his wife. The woman whose laughter used to fill all the empty spaces in his world. A brilliant creative director who could make entire corporations bend to her will. A woman from Brooklyn, fiercely, unapologetically herself, who never quite fit into the polished world his family insisted upon. They'd had 8 years of fire and devotion, and then nothing. Just divorce papers signed by hands that shook with the crushing weight of pride and betrayal. He'd convinced himself he had moved on. This new life, with Victoria on his arm and his name etched into the Manhattan skyline, was supposed to be the one he needed. It was calculated, elegant, and completely under his control. But that scent, that single thread from the past, was enough to unravel the entire lie. He shifted in his seat, his eyes scanning the room, telling himself he wasn't looking for her, but unable to stop. Every corner held a new possibility. Every server who drifted past with a tray suddenly seemed like a suspect. And underneath it all, the nagging question, was this guilt? Or was it longing? He pressed a hand to his temple, as if he could physically force the memory away. But some memories refused to be ignored. Ella was never just a ghost. She was like the chorus of a song you can't quite place, a melody that would surface uninvited in his quietest moments. She haunted the corners of his life he'd tried so desperately to erase. The maitre d' returned briefly, placing a water glass on the table. "Your guest should be arriving shortly, sir." Xavier gave a distracted nod, his mind a million miles away. His heart hammered unevenly in his chest. He hadn't let himself think about Ella in months, or so he kept telling himself. But now, under the glittering chandeliers of Celeste, her ghost felt as real as the light itself. This evening was meant to be exactly like all the others. The right wine would be poured, deals would be whispered, and polished smiles would be ready for the city's photographers. Instead, Xavier found himself alone at a corner table in New York's most exclusive restaurant. His empire was intact. His own face gleamed back at him from the silverware, and yet he felt empty, agitated, pulled back toward a chapter of his life he had sworn he would never open again. And you, my dear listener, if you've made it this far into this dazzling beginning, maybe you can feel it too. the current of tension running beneath the crystal, the storm that's gathering in Xavier's chest. Maybe you've picked up on the first clues of the story about to unravel, a story of passion, heartbreak, and the dangerous hope that second chances might actually exist. What would you do, sitting where Xavier is tonight, when your past shows up in a scent you can't possibly forget? Would you stand up and leave? Would you try to hide? Or would you simply wait to see what fate has in store? Drop what you think in the comments. I'm dying to know. And if you felt even a tiny spark from this opening, then stick around. Follow, and join me for the next chapter. Because, trust me, what comes next? You don't want to miss it. What happens when Xavier's gaze finally locks with Ellis's? You won't want to look away. The tumbler of pristine water on the table before him shimmered, catching the light like a flawless diamond. Xavier Garcia worried the links on his cuffs again, a completely unnecessary gesture. It was an old tic, a habit that followed him from tense negotiations into these opulent dining rooms. It was a small way to reclaim control when his mind started to wander. But no amount of fiddling with platinum could quiet the tempest brewing deep inside his chest. That fragrance, it was still there, weaving through the scents of gleaming silverware and the soft melody of the piano. Warm, grounding cinnamon, with a soft, lingering touch of vanilla. That wasn't the aroma of the restaurant. The chefs at Celeste crafted dishes that carried notes of saffron and truffle, of perfectly seared lamb and vintage balsamic. This was something else entirely personal, intimate. It was her scent, Ella Thompson. Just the thought of her name felt like tearing open a scar that had only barely healed over. He had convinced himself ages ago that he was past thinking about her, that his life was now entirely distinct, a new creation. The woman who once torched his entire world was meant to be just a faint memory. Yet, the hard truth was, she had never really left. Ella had been a current running just beneath his skin for all these years, lurking in the forgotten moments of his everyday life. She would appear when he'd see a canvas saturated with bold color, or catch a fragment of a poem on a subway poster. Whenever he heard laughter in a crowded room that was truly free and uninhibited, she was there, a melody whose chorus he could never fully shake. He shifted in his seat, trying to resist the magnetic pull of the past, but failing. Their marriage had lasted for 8 years. 8 years of such all-consuming passion that, at times, it had honestly terrified him. She was utterly brilliant and made no apologies for it. A creative force whose concepts could make corporations surrender, whose campaigns ignited debates from the highest boardrooms to college classrooms. Her mind was a tempest wild, stunning, and absolutely relentless. Yet Ella was so much more than just her intellect. She possessed an honesty so raw, it was jarring. A refusal to ever mold herself into the shape others expected. She never offered false praise. She never backed down. Her laughter was loud, and her tears were even more intense. She loved with her entire being, and she fought with that exact same ferocious energy. It was what had captivated him. It was what had ultimately shattered him, and it had sent shockwaves through his world. Xavier's family had never embraced her. His mother, Evelyn Garcia, in particular, saw Ella not as a soulmate for her son, but as an unwelcome disturbance. With her impeccable posture and perfectly strung pearls, Evelyn used silence as her preferred weapon. There were no raised voices, no overt insults. Instead, She could dismiss you with a single look, a calculated hesitation, or a smile so brittle it held no warmth at all. In her eyes, Ella was too boisterous, too common, too unpolished to carry the Garcia name. And Xavier, damn him, had been too much of a coward to fight for Ella with the ferocity she deserved. He'd tried to justify it as diplomacy, as a method of maintaining harmony between the woman he adored and the family who made him. But that kind of diplomacy is just another word for betrayal. And Ella saw right through it. Every time he stayed silent, another crack formed between them. Every time he failed to show up, it left a scar. Until one day, everything shattered. The memory returned now with brutal clarity, the sound of rain hammering the stone steps of their Brooklyn brownstone. Ella. She stood in the heart of the downpour, rain plastering her hair to her face, her eyes a tempest of fury and pain. "You only love me behind closed doors," she'd cried out, her voice trembling with the accusation. "The moment anyone looks, you shove me into the shadows. I'm not part of the pristine legacy your family demands, and you're too much of a coward to carve out a place for me." He had watched from the shelter of the doorway, drenched and unmoving, his own words laced with a brittle defensiveness. "You are an anchor, Ella. This endless chaos, these relentless arguments. I can't forge the future I'm destined for when you're constantly pulling me into meaningless wars." Of all the weapons he'd ever wielded, his words that night were the sharpest. They were also the final blow. Months later, as the divorce became official, her silence was a wound far deeper than any shout had ever been. The sound of her laughter vanished from their house. The ghost of her touch faded from his skin. He put his signature on the documents, convinced himself it was necessary, and walked into a perfectly curated existence. But no matter how pristine the facade, his kingdom of chrome and glass couldn't silence the truth. He'd erected skyscrapers, certainly, secured positions on boards, acquired penthouses, and graced the covers of glossy magazines. But in forfeiting Ella, he had forfeited the very rhythm of his own heart. And now, in this restaurant, Celeste. The faint echo of her scent dragged him back to that undeniable fact. He started to lift his water glass again, but his hand froze. There was a sound, the delicate chime of crystal on a server's tray, and a voice hushed, warm, and courteous. He angled his head, a subtle, careful movement, and his blood ran cold. It was her, Ella. She navigated the space between tables with an elegance born of repetition, not of happiness. Her simple black uniform was stretched just a bit too taut across her middle, pulled snug over the distinct, gentle curve of her stomach. With practiced skill, she balanced a tray laden with glassware. But he noticed how her other hand drifted to the small of her back, a subconscious motion to soothe the strain of carrying a new life within her. Her face. God. Her face still held that same breathtaking beauty, though life had left its weary mark. The creases of laughter by her eyes were softer now, her gaze haunted by a deep exhaustion. Her wild curls were tamed, pulled back into a neat knot at the base of her neck. And her smile. It was a polite, empty gesture that put wealthy patrons at ease, but betrayed nothing of the woman who wore it. A vice gripped Xavier's chest. She was pregnant, at least 7 months along, maybe even further. His thoughts spun into a frantic calculation. the numbers colliding. 7 months. Their divorce papers had been signed 8 months ago, but their ending had been messy. A slow and painful unraveling. There had been nights of relapse arguments that melted into desperate kisses, farewells that became feverish reunions. Could the baby be his? The possibility seized him, a brutal, stunning force that made the entire world dissolve. The low chatter of the restaurant faded to a distant drone. The glittering chandeliers became meaningless specks of light. She was gliding across the floor, carrying a life that could be a part of them both. His phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up Victoria. He ignored it. He couldn't possibly answer. His gaze tracked Ella as she set her tray down on a nearby table, inclining her head with a slight nod before turning to leave. She held herself tall, her movements efficient and professional. But Xavier saw the details no one else would, the weariness in her walk, the tightness across her shoulders, the gentle way her hand came to rest, protectively, over her stomach. She hadn't glanced his way once. Or maybe she was simply choosing not to see him. A war of 1,000 instincts raged inside him. He could rise, cross the vast expanse of the restaurant, and say her name. Or he could sit perfectly still and convince himself she was nothing more than an apparition, a phantom conjured from his own regret. For the first time in a decade, Xavier Garcia, the titan who closed billion-dollar deals without so much as a tremor, was completely paralyzed. He sank back into the plush leather of his chair, his gaze lost in the city lights swirling in the surface of a silver spoon. His breath came in shallow bursts, his chest aching with the weight of his next move. To ignore her would be simple, to entomb this memory under more layers of success, fortune, and the polished armor he wore every day. But to meet her gaze, to confront the undeniable life she now carried that would take a kind of bravery he had never once offered her. The grand clock on the far wall chimed, signaling another 15 minutes had passed in a night that now stretched into infinity. And with that sound, a resolve hardened within him. This was not another power dinner in Manhattan's most exclusive establishment, not an evening destined to be forgotten by morning. This was a moment of reckoning, a confrontation he had evaded for far too long. As he watched Ella melt into the shadowed recesses of the dining room, Xavier Garcia finally accepted that running was no longer an option. Not this time. The opulent hum of the restaurant continued around him, unchanged. Champagne flutes sang, cutlery met porcelain, and the soft melody of a piano drifted through the lavish space. Yet for Xavier Garcia, the entire world had just tilted on its axis. He couldn't force his eyes away. He tracked Ella's every movement as she navigated the floor. A simple black apron knotted securely at her waist, a heavy tray resting expertly in her hand. To the other patrons, she was just a waitress, anonymous and efficient. To Xavier, she was a supernova in a dark room. 8 years of history slammed into the present. He could hear her laughter echoing in their cramped Brooklyn apartment. He could feel the comforting warmth of her fingers laced through his as they hid from the rain under a dripping awning. He could see the fire in her gaze as she fought for dreams the world told her she couldn't have. And now, the gentle swell of her stomach, the silent, irrefutable evidence of a life taking root inside her. He'd been conditioned since birth to master his emotions, to conceal any vulnerability beneath a veneer of affluence and authority. But his control was shattering. His chest heaved, his palms growing damp where they rested on the starched linen. In that moment, Xavier Garcia wasn't one of Manhattan's most powerful billionaires. He was just a man, backed into a corner by his own past. Ella's back was toward him now, clearing away the remnants of a meal from a table of boisterous attorneys. She stacked the plates with a careful, measured precision. She moved with purpose. But Xavier could see the physical toll, how every motion was a quiet struggle against exhaustion. And then she pivoted, and his heart stopped cold. Her eyes, the ones he used to map like constellations, briefly scanned the room, deep brown like damp earth, cutting as shattered glass when she was angry, and impossibly soft when she loved. For one breathtaking second, her gaze landed on his. In that instant, Xavier forgot how to breathe. Her face was a perfect, placid mask. There was no spark of memory, no hint of anger, no sign of anything at all. Just cool, distant professionalism. It was an expression of pure detachment. It was an act. He knew it instinctively. He'd seen her radiate every emotion imaginable. But never this. Indifference was not in Ella Thompson's nature. And still, here she was, her gaze cutting right through him, as if he were just another face in the crowd. The emptiness of it carved a cavern in his chest. Across the room, Ella's fingers clenched around her service tray, knuckles turning bone white. She had spotted him the second she walked into the dining hall. That powerful silhouette was unmistakable, always poised, always in command, dressed in a suit that was tailored to perfection. The flash from his cufflinks was a quiet statement of power. And his face, though etched with a few more years, was still just as sharp, just as magnetic. He was the same man who trespassed in her dreams, night after night. She had tried so hard to forget Xavier, the man who was once her husband. Seeing him had stolen the air from her lungs. But she ruthlessly shoved the feeling down, burying it beneath the ironclad discipline she'd built since walking away from him. There was no time for shaking hands, no space for falling apart, not anymore. Not when every shift was a fight for survival. Not when each paycheck kept her afloat, and the gentle weight in her belly served as a constant reminder that her life was no longer just her own. So she had deliberately looked past him, reducing him to a nameless patron, pretending she couldn't feel the heat of his stare burning her skin from across the room, an unwanted spotlight. But inside, her heart was a frantic drumbeat. Ella was thrown back to the last night she ever laid in his arms. It came after a vicious fight, just like so many of their nights together. They had screamed until the words meant nothing, until their fury melted into a raw, desperate hunger. And then, there was only silence. His mouth on hers, his hands yanking her closer, in a collision that blurred the lines between pleasure and pain, leaving her wondering if their only language of love had always been destruction. A month after that, the test confirmed what she already knew in her soul. She was pregnant, but she held the secret close, telling no one. Not Xavier, and especially not his family, who had made it painfully clear she'd never belonged. She didn't even tell her own friends, knowing they would have pushed her to demand his support, to fight for what was rightfully hers. She had armed herself with silence, the same weapon he had so masterfully used against her. This wasn't an act of fear, it was an act of rebellion. This child would be hers alone, hers to shield, hers to cherish, hers to raise free from the suffocating shadow of the Garcia empire casting darkness over the cradle. But seeing him now, draped in luxury while she cleared plates for strangers, something inside her broke. It wasn't desire, but the brutal reminder of everything she had lost and everything she had willingly given up. Xavier couldn't breathe. It was an unbearable torture, sitting there cloaked in an invisible shroud while she moved about the room as if he didn't exist. He had spent years projecting an image of cool indifference, constructing a life so immaculate it practically sparkled under the city's watchful eye. But here, in the presence of Ella and the life she was carrying, his entire fortress crumbled to dust. He rose from his chair, a slow, deliberate motion. Julian, the maitre d', rushed toward him with a concerned look. "Mr. Garcia, is there a problem? Shall I find your guest for you?" Xavier barely registered the man's voice. His gaze was locked on Ella, who had just placed a heavy tray on a service stand near the kitchen. He crossed the floor before logic could chain him down. "Ella." Her whole body went rigid at the sound of his voice. She didn't turn around at first. Every cell in her body screamed at her to just keep moving, to escape behind the swinging doors, and never look back. But her pride anchored her to the spot. She would not run. When she finally pivoted to face him, he was there, up close. He was a jarring mix of achingly familiar and painfully different. The lines around his mouth seemed deeper, his eyes harder, colder, and yet, deep within their depths, in them, a flash of something vulnerable, something real, stopped her cold. Her name escaped his lips, a broken whisper that sounded almost like an apology. "Ella." Hearing him say it was almost enough to shatter her composure, but she forced herself to remain steady, cinching the ties of her apron tighter. She willed her voice to be level. "Mr. Garcia," she responded, the tone perfectly neutral, addressing him by his last name as if he were just another one of the restaurant's affluent patrons. A muscle in his jaw clenched at the deliberate distance she created. Just don't act like we're strangers to each other." She raised her chin defiantly, even as her fingers shook where they gripped the tray. "But aren't we?" Her unspoken question hung between them, sharp and unforgiving. The clamor of the dining room seemed to recede, leaving them isolated in the middle of it all, cocooned in a bubble of tension that no one dared to break. "I had no idea you were in town," he managed, his tone a hushed, desperate plea. "Why would you keep this from me?" His gaze dropped, for a split second to her midsection, a glance so quick he barely registered it. Her pulse hammered, but her expression remained a mask of stone. "Because you have no right to know." Xavier felt his own throat constrict. "Ella," he started, but she stopped him with a sharp shake of her head. "You decided how this would go. Xavier, don't forget. You picked silence. You picked your family. And now I'm making my own choice." Each word was a heavy weight, building a wall between them, brick by brick. For the first time in a very long time, Xavier was completely powerless. He could negotiate billion-dollar deals and build corporate empires from nothing, bending the world to his desires. But Ella, she was the one variable, the one person he had never been able to command. And facing her now, he understood that control was the last thing he wanted. What he craved was something infinitely more perilous. He craved a chance at redemption. Just then, the kitchen doors swung wide behind her, bathing her silhouette in a warm golden glow. She pivoted, her tray held expertly again, her entire posture radiating a clear message. Stay away. I hope you enjoy your meal, Mr. Garcia, she murmured, her voice quiet, and then she was gone. Xavier remained rooted to the spot, the frantic beat of his heart echoing in his ears as his composure shattered. Because as he watched her disappear back into the kitchen's hazy light, one single truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. Whatever secret Ella was protecting, he couldn't deny his part in it any longer. It was his. Her shift finally dragged to a close well after midnight, as the city's electric energy softened into a gentle, sleeping hum. Inside Celeste, the grand chandeliers were lowered, the ambient music had ceased, and the echoes of wealthy patrons' laughter were now just a faint ghost in the air. The staff began to depart in small groups, their soft footsteps tapping against the polished marble floors, their voices muted by sheer weariness. Ella pulled her coat more snugly around her body, the inexpensive material offering little defense against the sharp autumn chill that whipped down the service alley. She moved deliberately, her pace measured and burdened by both the long shift and the precious life growing inside her. The air was thick with the scent of damp pavement and stale cigarette smoke. In the distance, the rumble of a taxi faded away. The neon sign of a nearby bar cast a faint, rhythmic glow, illuminating the glossy film of recent rain on the blacktop. Ella let out a slow breath, watching it turn to mist in the cold. Her hand found its way, as it always did, to rest protectively over her belly. Just the two of us, she murmured into the night. That's all that matters. Yet as the words left her lips, a familiar tightness seized her throat. On the subway, she found an empty seat in the corner, distancing herself from the handful of other late-night travelers. Her own reflection looked out at her from the dark window pane, a woman exhausted, but far from defeated. Wisps of her curly hair had broken free from their pins, creating a soft halo of frizz around her face. Deep shadows were etched beneath her eyes, and her mouth was set in a hard line that betrayed a subtle tremor. 8 years together, followed by 8 months of crushing silence, had all led to this moment. She once believed Xavier Garcia was a man she had consigned to her past, a character sealed away in a chapter of her life she vowed never to visit again. But tonight, destiny had openly mocked her resolve. In his gaze, she saw a flicker of recognition, a look that suggested the years had failed to build any real wall between them. And the cruelest part, seeing him had awakened a ghost of a feeling she had sworn an oath to smother forever, the memory of love. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to banish the thought. No. That feeling had shattered her world. It had stolen her peace, her confidence, and the dream of a family she had hoped to create without having to surrender a part of herself. It had left her utterly alone, forsaken by the man who could command boardrooms, but couldn't stand up to his own mother. She refused to walk that same broken path a second time. For Xavier, the night was only just beginning its descent. He had left Celeste, but the thought of returning to his penthouse with its sterile glass walls and echoing silence felt suffocating. Instead, he gave his driver a simple order: circle the city, as if the perpetual motion could somehow soothe the tempest brewing in his chest. The city lights streaked past the window, the glitter of Fifth Avenue, the radiant arch of Washington Square, the stoic towers of Wall Street keeping their silent vigil. But every landmark was replaced by visions of her, Ella, moving with an exhausted elegance as she held a tray. Ella, her face a mask of neutrality, her eyes 1,000 miles away. Ella, her body holding the gentle swell of a new life. The idea was an unyielding coil around his mind. It could be his child, theirs. Xavier had stared down financial calamities that could erase fortunes, delivered speeches that moved global markets, and remained impassive under the relentless scrutiny of politicians and the press. But none of it had ever paralyzed him with the kind of terror this one possibility ignited. Because if it was true, then every decision he'd made, every silence he'd kept, every betrayal had not only cost him Ella, it had cost him his claim to a family that might already exist. The driver's voice sliced through his torment. "Mr. Garcia, shall I take you home?" Xavier paused. "Not yet. Drive to Brooklyn." The man's eyebrow lifted in the rearview mirror, but he said nothing. He was paid not to ask questions. Xavier sank back against the plush leather, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the glass as the cityscape transformed. Brooklyn, the borough he had once shared with her. Their brownstones still stood, a property he owned but had left as a hollowed-out relic of their laughter, their arguments, of nights both tender and brutal. He hadn't set foot inside since the divorce, but he knew the streets still held their ghosts, miles away. Ella emerged from the subway, just 2 blocks from her apartment. The neighborhood was more subdued than Manhattan, but it was alive. Corner bodegas cast a faint, humming glow. A vendor pushed a cart, and the rich scent of roasted peanuts drifted on the air. From an open window overhead, the mournful notes of a jazz trumpet spiraled down into the night. Her building was old, its bricks weathered, and the steps chipped at the edges. She climbed them one at a time, each movement deliberate. By the time she reached her door, a dull ache radiated from her back, and her hands trembled with exhaustion. Inside, the apartment was small but immaculate. The walls were painted a pale yellow, an attempt to bring warmth into the cramped rooms. A crib sat partially assembled in the corner, its instructions spread out on the floor like an unsolved riddle. A neat stack of bills was arranged on the table, unopened but organized. Ella let her coat fall from her shoulders, dropped her bag, and collapsed into the single armchair by the window. She pressed a hand protectively against her stomach, closing her eyes. She had no one to lean on, no partner to share this with, to get herself through those nights when the fear was a deafening roar, with no family to come running to her aid. It was only her and this baby. But she had been through fire before. She always came out the other side. On the street below, a luxury car glided to a stop. Xavier studied the building from the darkened interior of the vehicle, a war raging in his chest. He shouldn't have come. He had forfeited that right. But watching her vanish into that tiny apartment, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep, her resilience a cloak of solitude. He found himself unable to drive away. He saw a ghost of the Ella who once had colossal dreams, who wanted to paint her vision across the world and leave an indelible mark. not only on canvases and in meeting rooms, but on people's souls. He was forced to wonder if that light had been extinguished, and if he was the one who had smothered the flame. The engine hummed, but Xavier was paralyzed. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, his entire empire was meaningless. His influence, his fortune, and his name were all empty shells next to the woman who had once captured his spirit, and now, he suspected, carried his child. He ached to go to her, to rap on that door, to get on his knees and beg for a single chance to make things right. But the terror of her rejection, of seeing that ice return to her eyes, kept him imprisoned in his seat. So he remained in the silence, his eyes fixed on the soft glow from her window, until the first hint of dawn streaked the sky. Inside, Ella shifted. Sleep had been a turbulent sea, constantly broken by the tide of her dreams. There was no escaping them. She got out of bed, stretching her aching spine, and peered out the window. The street was mostly deserted. A handful of cars drove past, their beams of light fading into the gray. For a split second, she thought she saw a shadow where one shouldn't be, a polished black car, perfectly still, hugging the curb. Her pulse hammered as a cold sense of dread washed over her. She snatched the curtain shut, her hand pressed against the worn fabric. A part of her, maybe instinct or a lingering memory, knew that he hadn't truly left. The sun rose, spilling liquid gold over the city. From her apartment, Ella braced for another day of struggle, her heart shielded and her determination absolute. From his car, Xavier accepted that he needed to maintain his watch from afar. Their paths had violently crossed again, and no amount of time or quiet could erase the collision. Because destiny, once it sets its sights, is brutally persistent in its pursuit. And Xavier Garcia, despite all his might, was about to find that love was the single fight he could not conquer with brute force. The morning air held a biting chill that worked its way under jackets and settled deep in the bones. Brooklyn was waking up in fits and starts. The metallic rattle of shop gates being rolled up, the shuffle of children dragging their school bags, plumes of steam rising from coffee carts on the corners. In a little apartment filled with pale morning light, Ella stood at a cracked mirror, securing the last button on her blouse. The material pulled taut, ever so slightly. Across her stomach, a quiet but constant reminder. She scowled, pulled her cardigan tighter around her, and forced her reflection to look composed. Every single morning was a tightrope walk between sheer exhaustion and fierce willpower, between her vulnerability and her strength. She planted her palms flat on the sink to ground herself. "You are going to be fine," she whispered to the life growing within. "We are going to be fine." Her voice shook, but the words had become a necessary mantra, repeated not from a place of belief, but of pure survival. By the time she stepped outside, the metropolis was fully alive. The sound of car horns, the calls of vendors, and the relentless pulse of life filled the air. Ella moved at a measured pace, watching her step on the broken sidewalks, her handbag clutched tightly to her body. What she failed to sense, what she wasn't aware of, what she failed to notice, was the obsidian sedan stationed just down the block. Behind its darkened windows, a man sat wide awake, having spent the entire night mentally pacing the length of her quiet street, consumed by a gnawing sense of guilt. Xavier Garcia never meant to stay this long. He'd told himself this was pure insanity, that he had absolutely no business tailing her like some phantom. But as the sun began to rise, he remained, held fast by an impulse he couldn't define and was powerless to fight. His eyes followed her every move. Her pace was even, but unhurried. Her expression, a mask of silent determination. She was a woman bearing a weight far greater than her own. Something constricted in his chest. This wasn't the same Ella he'd abandoned. The one he recalled was a spitfire, erupting with laughter one moment and fury the next, never hesitating to confront him, even when the rest of the world cowered before him. This version of Ella was more subdued, though still powerful, just whittled down by loneliness. Her inferno had cooled to glowing embers, but in his eyes, she shone just as brightly. For both of them, the day dragged on endlessly. Inside the restaurant, Ella seamlessly resumed her duties. Her smile was courteous. Her movements were precise. Her presence almost ghost-like. Yet under that composed exterior, exhaustion gnawed at her. She would subtly brace herself against a wall when the burden became overwhelming. She'd bite down on her lip whenever a dull ache snaked up her spine. Nobody saw. Or maybe nobody bothered to look. She had perfected the facade of being perfectly fine while she was falling apart on the inside. Back in his world, Xavier went through the motions of his day. His corporate skyscraper shone over Manhattan, a testament to his power. Assistants delivered agreements. His advisors urged him to sign, but his concentration was completely fractured. The figures on the page swam together. The words were just empty shapes. His every thought was consumed by visions of her, the vacant stare she'd given him at Celeste's, the gentle arc of her hand as it rested on her belly, the incredible fortitude required to navigate life alone, carrying a baby, his baby. That realization took root inside him, a perilous and persistent thorn. By mid-afternoon, the deafening quiet of his own mind became unbearable. Night descended again. Ella's walk home was more sluggish than the mornings, her entire body sore after so many hours on her feet, her mind weighed down. The train rumbled past. The city buzzed around her as she pushed forward, her coat pulled snugly around her, her stride resolute. It wasn't until she was right at her building that she saw him. Xavier was waiting by a lamppost, his silhouette impossible to mistake, even cloaked in shadow. Tall and broad. His coat was impeccably tailored, but simple. He possessed an aura that seemed to warp the very air he occupied. Commanding and absolute. The air hitched in her throat. She stopped dead at the foot of the stairs, her keys digging into her palm. Ella. His voice was soft, deliberate, as if he were afraid of shattering the delicate tension hanging between them. Her heart hammered against her ribs. How often had she heard that voice in her mind? Sometimes it was a source of solace, other times a torment. But this was real, far too near, far too risky. She raised her chin, gathering her resolve. What are you doing here? I couldn't stay away. You don't owe me anything anymore. His jaw clenched. That's a lie. For just a second, the world around them seemed to dissolve. The hum of cars, the voices of people walking past it all melted away, leaving only the profound silence between two souls who had once known everything about each other and now faced one another like total strangers. I saw you. Xavier's voice was strained as he went on. At the restaurant. I couldn't just walk away. Not after. He trailed off, swallowing hard, then shook his. I need you to explain, he began. But Ella's voice, a fragile blade, sliced through his. There's nothing to explain. Xavier, we were finished years ago. Whatever fantasy you've been holding on to is over. His gaze dropped instinctively to the gentle swell of her stomach. It doesn't look over. A sharp breath hitched in her throat. A tempest of rage, fear, and a deep, unwanted longing surged through her. But she schooled her features into a mask of calm. This child, she stated coldly, is mine. The declaration hung between them, heavy and absolute. Xavier moved closer, his steps deliberate and slow, as if afraid any sudden action would make her bolt. Ella, if it's mine, if there is even the slightest chance, don't I have a right to know? The word deserve caught in her throat. A bitter pill. A harsh, broken laugh escaped her lips. You believe you're entitled to anything after the deafening silence you left me in. After you prioritized your family's name over your own wife, you surrendered every right you had the day you vanished without a trace. E recoiled as if struck, yet he held his ground. You're right. My cowardice was unforgivable. I told myself I was protecting us by not fighting them. But all I did was shatter us. But this... His voice fractured as he gestured toward her, his motion tender and almost worshipful. This changes everything. I can't walk away from it. Ella spun around, her back ramrod straight as she ascended the steps. You can, and you will. She reached the door, her keys rattling in her trembling hand. But just before she could escape, his voice stopped her, more a raw whisper than a shout. I still love you. Her hand froze on the cold brass of the doorknob. The 3 words coiled around her, as suffocating and intangible as smoke. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting a tidal wave of memories his touch, a phantom heat on her skin, his promises, mere echoes in the darkness, the way he used to look at her, as if she was the only solid thing in a world of lies. But love hadn't been enough to save them. Not back then. Not when his absence had carved a void inside her. Not after she'd begged him to pick her. And he had chosen to leave. With a steadying breath, she unlocked the door. Without turning back, she whispered, Love wasn't what kept me alive through the nights. Xavier, my own strength did, and I found it long after you were gone. The door clicked shut, a sound of absolute finality between them. Xavier stood alone in the chill of the evening, her last words cutting deeper than any blade ever could. Yet, even in the face of her rejection, he felt a resolve stronger than his wounded pride or his fear. It didn't matter how firmly Ella barred the way. He knew he couldn't and wouldn't abandon her again. That night, Ella muffled her sobs in her pillow. Her hand curved protectively over her belly. She hated him for making her feel so weak, for making her body tremble with words alone. She hated that a foolish, buried part of her still wanted to believe him. Meanwhile, Xavier stood on the desolate street below, his eyes fixed on the dim light of her window until the sky grayed with dawn. The certainty of his next move settling deep in his bones. He would not be silent this time. This time, he would win her back. The morning sun cast soft stripes of light into Ella's small apartment, piercing the thin curtains to illuminate the scuffed wooden floors. Specks of dust danced in the sunbeams, suspended in the air like fragmented memories, always present, but just out of reach. Ella sat on the edge of her bed, hair falling in a disheveled cascade around her face, one hand resting gently on her stomach. She felt a faint flutter from within, a tiny movement, a chaotic flutter in her heart, a mix of pure bliss and paralyzing fear. Sleep had been impossible. His voice was an echo in the silence behind her eyelids. I still love you. 3 words that once grounded her now felt like a tempest. They crashed against the walls of her chest, threatening to reopen wounds she'd spent years stitching closed. She got out of bed, drifting through the cozy apartment with an instinctive stealth. The kettle shrieked, clouding the kitchen with steam, but the sound barely registered. Her eyes were fixed on the half-assembled crib, standing sentinel in the corner, its bare wooden frame a stark testament to her future, to the reason she needed to be unbreakable. She ran a hand along the smooth wood, her fingertips shaking. This baby deserved a foundation of certainty, not a whirlwind of doubt. Not the heartache from a man whose love was loud in promises, but vanished into nothingness. Still, the memories slipped past her guard, arriving without invitation. Xavier's laugh, so infrequent, but so completely captivating. The evenings they'd spent dancing without shoes in their former kitchen. Music pouring from a tiny speaker as he murmured sweet nothings in Spanish against her skin. The mornings he would wake her with a kiss and a cup of coffee, breathing vows of an endless future. Those moments had seemed unbreakable, right up until the moment they shattered. She tightened her jaw, forcing back the burn of unshed tears. The version of him who appeared at her apartment last night was a stranger, not the man who had once embraced her with such passion. He couldn't be, and she was too vulnerable to let herself think anything else. Far across town, Xavier gazed out of his panoramic office window, the cityscape sprawling out beneath him. Manhattan was a glittering jewel of unapologetic splendor, its skyscrapers piercing the morning haze. He had constructed a significant portion of it. Entire districts carried his signature. His fortune was part of the city's very DNA. And yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, it all seemed utterly meaningless. Multi-million-dollar contracts sat ignored on his mahogany desk. Important calls were being screened. The business empire that consumed his every waking moment suddenly paled in comparison to a single, powerful fact. Ella was still out there, living, struggling, and carrying a child that he suspected was his. The previous evening had been devastating, her denial cutting him to the core, her response colder than the night air. Love is not what kept me warm. My own strength did. He'd earned every single one of those words. But underneath that armor, he'd caught a glimmer of something else. It wasn't forgiveness, not even close, but it was softer than pure hatred. It was a sign she hadn't wiped him from her memory entirely. He wouldn't waste this chance. Ella was back at Celeste by afternoon, her bearing impeccable, her features carefully arranged. The restaurant sparkled with its usual opulence gleaming crystal, plush velvet, and the low thrum of affluence and whispered deals. She navigated the space like a phantom, a study in perfect, unnoticed service. Her smile was always ready, but it never touched her eyes. But behind that professional facade, her mind was a raging tempest. She kept replaying their confrontation in front of her apartment, analyzing every word, every look that passed between them. The way Xavier's gaze had been so direct, so vulnerable, so raw. The way he talked about his own cowardice, his profound regret, and most terrifying of all, the way he claimed he still loved her. She desperately wanted to despise him. She needed it to be that straightforward. But nothing about anything involving Xavier Garcia was ever straightforward. As the final diners trickled out for the night, she stayed behind in the cavernous, empty dining room, methodically polishing the already spotless tables. The dimmed chandeliers cast a soft, regal glow, their light glinting off the polished silverware. The illusion of solitude shattered the moment she turned around. Xavier was standing near the entrance, his presence filling the doorway with an undeniable authority. His expression was guarded, all the tailored arrogance and effortless charm gone, leaving only a man humbled by his own regrets. Ella's jaw clenched. "You can't keep showing up like this. I had to see you," he murmured. "Well, you've seen me. Now you can go." He didn't budge. Instead, his hand disappeared into his coat and emerged with a small, faded photograph. He handled it with a delicate care, almost a reverence, before stepping forward to place it gently on the table that separated them. Ella's breath hitched. It was a picture of them from years ago, from before the silence and the cracks that tore them apart. They were laughing, her head thrown back in joy, his arm draped around her shoulders. Both of them possessed a carefree spirit that now felt like a distant fantasy. "I kept this," Xavier said, his voice soft. "All this time, through everything, because even when I walked out like a coward, I never truly left." His voice fractured, but he forced it back into line. "I never stopped carrying you with me." Ella's hands shook as she let her fingertips graze the photo's surface, only to pull away sharply as if she'd been burned. "This doesn't undo what you did," she whispered. "I know." His gaze held hers, completely unflinching. "But I'm not here to undo it. I'm here to prove I'm not the same man who walked away from you." Silence filled the room. The distant clink of cutlery from the kitchen was the only sound in the vast emptiness between them. Ella desperately wanted to shove him away, to throw his picture in his face and retreat behind the walls she had so carefully constructed. But a fragile, traitorous part of her longed to believe him, a feeling that terrified her more than anything. "You don't get to just show up and rewrite our history," she finally managed, her voice taut with strain. "You don't get to stand here and pretend to be the person I needed back then." His eyes softened, a flicker of sorrow crossing his face. "Maybe I wasn't who you needed then, but I want to be the man you need now. For you. And for—" His gaze dropped, almost involuntarily, to her belly. "For the baby." Ella's breath caught. White-hot anger surged through her, at his presumption, at his nerve, and at the way he could still ignite something inside her she thought was long extinguished. "You don't even know this baby is yours," she snapped, the words harsh. But the tremble in her voice betrayed her pain. Xavier didn't flinch. He just stepped closer, his voice gentle. "Then let me find out. Let me try. Because if there is the smallest chance, I can't turn my back again. Not on you, not on our child." Ella whirled around, clutching a cleaning rag in her hand as if it were a shield. Her chest rose and fell with the weight of all her unspoken words. She hated him for his sheer audacity, and she hated herself for the way her heart hammered in response. Because deep down, buried beneath the pain and the years of anger, she wanted to believe him. And that was the most dangerous truth of all. Later that night, back in her apartment, Ella sat in an armchair by the window, staring out at the city lights. The photograph sat on the table beside her, its edges worn, its image a cruel reminder of what once was and what could never be again. She picked it up, studied their faces, and then pressed it to her heart. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as she whispered into the quiet room. "Why now? Why did you have to come back when I finally learned how to live without you?" But there was... She gave no reply. Just the heavy, solitary beat of her own heart in the stillness of the room, miles away. Xavier sat alone in a penthouse swallowed by shadows, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Her fury, her dismissal, her pain, he had earned every bit of it. And yet, he'd seen it. That tiny, almost imperceptible softening in her gaze as her fingers brushed against the photograph. It was all he needed. It was enough to keep fighting, to keep holding on, to hope. Because Xavier Garcia had already lost Ella Thompson once. And he knew he couldn't survive losing her a second time. The night deepened, and Ella's apartment was silent save for the low hum of the city breathing just beyond her window pane. She was curled into an armchair, the photograph on the side table a beautiful, agonizing reminder of what they'd lost. Her eyes felt heavy with exhaustion, but the sleep that finally claimed her offered no peace. Instead, it pulled her backward, all the way to the very beginning. She could still feel the moment she first laid eyes on him. It was at a charity fundraiser in Harlem, years before, back when she was just a grad student juggling classes with a part-time job at the library. She'd been dragged there to help a professor with a presentation on an educational program. The entire ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos, with crystal chandeliers casting a glow on an atmosphere thick with influence and wealth. And then she saw him. Xavier Garcia. He was holding court near the edge of the room, his suit exquisitely tailored, his dark hair styled with an easy perfection, and his eyes as sharp and clear as glass. People gravitated toward him, drawn by the power of his name and his sheer presence. But his confident demeanor faltered for a second as his gaze swept across the room and finally landed on her, the girl in a simple dress with faint ink smudges on her fingertips. He moved across the ballroom with an undeniable purpose, completely ignoring the whispers that followed in his wake, and stopped right in front of her. "I'm Xavier." His voice was rich and deep, and when he spoke to her, it lacked the rehearsed polish he used with everyone else. A nervous laugh escaped her as she shook his offered hand, wondering what a man of his stature could possibly want with her. But he did want to know her. That evening, he asked her things no one ever thought to ask, about her classes, her ambitions, her love for books and for the community she worked in. He actually listened, hanging on her every word as if they were more important than the billion-dollar deals pending on his phone. By the end of the night, she felt truly seen for the first time in her life. So when he asked if he could take her out again, her heart screamed yes, long before her practical mind could object. Their love story was an absolute whirlwind. They were from two completely different universes, his built on a foundation of gold, hers on pure grit and determination. But together, their connection burned away every single one of their differences. He swept her into a world of penthouses and boardrooms. She pulled him into her world of smoky jazz clubs, dusty old bookstores, and corner coffee shops where nobody knew his net worth. They would talk until the sun came up, argue until they were breathless, and love until the entire world simply faded into the background. He was both her calm and her chaos, all at once. When he asked her to marry him, she sobbed into his chest, her answer tumbling out before he'd even finished asking the question. In the beginning, marriage was a dizzying, beautiful dream. Their home was always filled with music, with laughter, and the scent of the meals they'd cooked together late at night. He would murmur promises to her in Spanish, his lips against her skin, and she had believed every single one. For a brief, shining moment, forever felt real. But forever, she learned, was a fragile thing. It started not with a fight, but with the quiet moments in between. Xavier's family had never given their blessing. His mother's civility was a thin, icy layer. Her smiles looked like they could crack, and her words were surgical in the way they cut Ella down without ever raising her voice. His father, however, was a different story entirely. A cold, condescending man who warned Xavier that Ella was nothing more than an inconvenient phase, a complication he couldn't afford. In the beginning, Xavier had fought for her with everything he had, but under the constant assault, his resolve began to fracture. The nights at the office stretched longer and longer, his phone a constant companion even in their bed, effectively building a wall of business calls where intimacy once lived. When the inevitable fights about family and children erupted, he would simply shut down. The issues were never resolved, just shelved for another day, until the evening she finally voiced the one question that terrified her most. Will you ever pick me over them? The deafening quiet that filled the room was all the answer she needed. That final night was a wound that never truly healed. Their fight had echoed through the house, their voices cracking against the very walls that had once contained their love. She had implored him to stand up for her, for what they had, for the future they had sworn to build together. He just stood there, paralyzed, guilt written all over his face. But a chilling finality crept into his tone when he spoke. I can't. Just those two words. That was it. And then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone amidst the wreckage of their life. The period that followed was a hazy nightmare of pure, crushing grief, one painful memory at a time. She packed up the photos, the letters, methodically dismantling the life they had shared. She made a solemn vow that no man would ever have that kind of hold on her again. She pieced herself back together, one agonizing day at a time. Ella shot up in bed, her heart pounding, a tightness seizing her chest and the cold dampness of tears on her face. The bedroom was pitch black, the city's hum a distant drone beyond the window. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, trying to calm the ragged rhythm of her breathing. A soft flutter from within her served as a gentle reminder that while the past was inescapable, her future was right here, growing inside her. Her voice was a shaky whisper in the darkness. I will not let him shatter me a second time. But the words felt hollow as her treacherous heart clenched with the phantom sensation of his touch, the echo of his laugh. The ghost of the man she was once so certain was her destiny. Miles away, in a sprawling mansion, Xavier was sitting in his study, his fingers tracing the worn edges of an old photograph he kept in his pocket. A fire roared in the hearth, but a profound chill had settled deep in his bones. He remembered it all. The sound of her laughter filling their tiny kitchen. The soft way she would murmur his name in the dead of night. He remembered the fear that had driven him to walk away, telling himself it was the only way to protect her. He'd kept those memories locked away for years, but laying eyes on her again had ripped open every single scar. And now, one thing was terrifyingly clear. He could own half the city, but none of it meant a thing if she wasn't in it. The week that followed turned into a silent battle between what was and what could be. Ella did her best to dodge him, throwing herself into her job, getting ready for the baby, anything to create a distraction from the man who haunted her thoughts. But it was useless. He was inescapable. His ghost lingered in the slight curve of her lips when she forgot to be guarded, in the sudden blush that flooded her cheeks at the memory of his voice. Xavier, for his part, started making his moves, but carefully this time. Gone was the arrogant billionaire who believed love was a given. In his place was a man humbled, desperate to reclaim even a fraction of the life he'd thrown away. There were no bouquets, no extravagant gifts, just his quiet, patient presence, watching, waiting, and praying. Fate, however, had other plans. As Ella was making her way home one night, a searing pain shot through her midsection, so sharp and vicious it stole her breath. She buckled, clutching against a lamppost, a strangled gasp escaping her as panic set in. The crowd flowed past, oblivious, a river of faces in a city that had no time for her terror. Her vision swam, fear choking her, and then she heard his voice cut through the chaos. Strong arms encircled her just as her knees gave out. His scent, so familiar and dangerously calming, enveloped her. A primal urge to shove him away, to scream until her throat was raw, fought against the wave of agony that stole her voice. All she could manage was to hold on to him, his grip a desperate anchor as he murmured her name like a sacred vow. In that dizzying instant, with the world tilting on its axis and her body trembling uncontrollably, Ella finally collided with the reality she'd been desperately outrunning. Xavier Garcia was far from finished with her, and deep down, a part of her knew she wasn't finished with him either, no matter how fiercely she wished it were true. The world dissolved into a smear of light and shadow. Ella's fingers dug into Xavier's sleeve, a sharp, brutal pain in her abdomen tearing through what little composure she had left. The clamor of the streets, the glare of the lights, the endless noise, it all faded into a distant hum as her world narrowed to a pinprick. Her own body had turned on her, and cold, sharp fear was all that remained. Stay with me. Xavier's command was a low, steady anchor in the fog. His arm was a band of steel around her waist, steering her toward a sleek black car idling at the curb. The driver scrambled out, his expression alarmed. But Xavier snapped an order that crackled with authority. The hospital. Now. Ella tried to form a protest, to insist she was fine, that she didn't need his help. But her lips quivered, and no sound came out. Once inside the car, he pressed her hand flat against his chest, his thumb tracing slow, soothing circles over her skin. She despised the sense of security it gave her, loathed how much she craved the shelter of his warmth. The fluorescent lights of the hospital were jarringly bright, casting a cold, sterile glow over everything. Nurses descended, moving with purpose as they swept Ella into an examination room. Their voices were clinical and detached as they started tests, attached monitors, and recorded her vital signs. Xavier shadowed them, his presence a silent, immovable force they couldn't dismiss. His jaw was set like stone, and his nearness was a strange mix of comfort and suffocating weight. Ella lay on the crisp paper of the bed, squeezing her eyes shut against the sterile room. She focused on her shallow breaths, trying to block out the rhythmic beeping of the machine, the soft squeak of shoes on tile, and the nurse's murmured reassurances. Then, beneath it all, a whisper reached her. "I've got you," Xavier breathed, his voice so soft it was as if he feared she might break. The doctor entered, a woman with a kind but efficient demeanor, who explained the pain was likely a stress-induced spasm, alarming, but not dangerous. Then came the sound of the baby's heartbeat, a strong, powerful cadence that washed the tension from the room. A shuddering breath escaped Ella's lips. She hadn't even noticed he was still standing right there beside her. Xavier lowered his head, his grip on her hand tightening almost painfully. He squeezed his eyes shut for a long moment, and when he looked up, the glint of unshed tears in his eyes stunned her. "You are both perfectly fine," the doctor confirmed with a gentle smile before slipping out of the room. A profound silence settled in her wake. Ella turned her face away, finding it impossible to look at Xavier. The seconds ticked by, punctuated only by the steady pulse of the heart monitor. When Xavier finally broke the quiet, his voice was frayed and raw. "I honestly thought I was about to lose you." She kept her eyes shut, his admission a physical weight on her chest. "You already did." The words fell into the space between them, their truth a cold, hard thing. Xavier recoiled as if she'd slapped him, yet he refused to release her hand. "Maybe I did," he conceded, his voice barely audible. "But tonight, Ella, I swear to you, I couldn't breathe when I saw you collapse. Nothing else existed. Not my company, not this entire city, not even myself. There was only you." Her throat felt tight. She desperately wanted to tell him to. She had to stop letting herself hope, stop trying to patch her broken heart with it. But as she lay there, her body still humming with the aftershock of the fall, she just didn't have the energy. The nurse reappeared for a moment, checked her vitals, and confirmed she was cleared to go home and rest. Xavier hung on the nurse's every word, absorbing each instruction with the focus of a soldier committing his orders to memory. Ella tried to argue that she was fine, that she didn't need an escort home, but the look in his eyes shut down her protests. So there she was, once again, inside his car. The city lights melted into streaks of color against the tinted glass. The world outside was a chaotic blur, but within the car, a fragile silence enveloped them, threatening to shatter at the slightest sound. Xavier was close, his hand resting over hers, not demanding, not forcing, just a warm, steady presence. "Ella," he broke the quiet, his voice low. "I know I'm the last person you want here. I know you don't want me holding your hand right now. But I need you to believe me when I say I will never walk away again. Not from you. Not from our baby." A vice clamped around her chest at his words, and she turned her head sharply to the window, blinking furiously against the heat welling in her eyes. "Don't make promises you have no intention of keeping," she murmured. His reply was instant, definite. "This time, I won't let you down." Back at her apartment, Ella insisted she could get inside on her own, But Xavier followed her anyway, carrying her bag, his hand hovering near the small of her back, as if he feared she would simply crumble again. She fumbled with the lock, pushed the door open into the small living space, and turned to block his path. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her tone regaining some of its familiar bite. He glanced around the humble apartment, the worn rug, the half-finished crib in the corner, the walls lined with second-hand books. His expression softened, a deep reverence flickering in his gaze. "I belong wherever you are," he said, his voice quiet. Her heart gave a treacherous lurch, but she covered it with a scoff. "Go home, Xavier." For what felt like an eternity, he didn't budge. His eyes were locked on hers, intense and unreadable. At last, he gave a slow nod. "Fine, I'll go," he conceded. He stepped away, his fingertips brushing hers in a fleeting farewell. "But I'll be back tomorrow to check on you." Ella's hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She needed to tell him no. She needed to slam the door in his face. Instead, she just stood there, silent. And when the door finally clicked shut, she sagged into the chair next to the crib, her body shaking, not from fear, but from the terrifying truth that a piece of her was desperate for him to keep that promise. In his penthouse, Xavier poured a drink he had no intention of touching. The glass remained on the desk, forgotten, as he stared out at the city, its glittering skyscrapers seeming pointless and hollow without her. He kept replaying the night in his head, the way she'd collapsed, the fragile tremor in her voice, the sight of her looking so pale and small under the harsh hospital lights. For the first time in years, he had been rendered completely powerless. And yet, holding her hand, listening to the steady beat of his child's heart, had sparked something fierce inside him. This was his second chance, his very last one, and he refused to waste it. Ella was awake long after midnight, her hand resting protectively over the curve of her belly. The baby's steady thumps were reassuring, but her mind was a tempest. Xavier's face haunted her, the raw desperation in his gaze, the quiet conviction in his voice. She told herself not to trust him. She told herself he was a hurricane, beautiful but devastating, and she had already survived his destruction once. But her heart, her foolish heart, remembered. It remembered the man, the one who'd spun her around their old kitchen, barefoot, and woken her with a soft kiss and the scent of fresh coffee. But it also held the ghost of the man who walked away. While the city was silent, neither Xavier nor Ella could find any peace. That was because love, the real kind, refused to stay buried. And they both felt the first tremors of something delicate, perilous, and utterly undeniable for the first time in ages. Hope. The next morning, a soft but steady rapping at the door pulled Ella from her sleep. It was persistent, rhythmic. For a moment she thought it was part of a dream, but it sounded again, this time more firm, more certain. She pushed herself upright, still conscious of the aches that had settled in from the night before. Shrugging on a robe, she made her way to the door and pulled it open a few inches, ready to snap at whoever had the nerve to bother her. But it was him. Xavier was leaning in the hallway, not in the sharp armor of a designer suit, but something far softer: dark jeans and a simple shirt. Its sleeves rolled up his forearms. He was holding a paper bag, and the warm scent of bread and coffee drifted from it. "Breakfast," he offered, his voice surprisingly gentle, almost uncertain. Ella blinked, her brow knitting in confusion. "You can't just appear like this. I said I would," he reminded her, his tone low and steady. "To check on you." Her immediate impulse was to shut the door in his face. She wanted to tell him that his promises were worthless, shattered long ago. But a combination of exhaustion and sheer curiosity stopped her. She simply stepped aside, and he came in, his presence immediately filling her small apartment like an invasive ray of sunshine. He unpacked the bag with a surprising and familiar ease. Inside was a croissant, a small carton of fresh fruit, and a hot cup of decaf coffee. Her mouth opened, ready to lecture him on boundaries and her independence, about everything. But he handed her the cup before she could speak, and its warmth seeped into her cold fingers, stealing the words right out of her mouth. "Eat," Xavier said, his voice soft. The way he said it, a gentle suggestion instead of a command, struck her. The man she used to know would have insisted, his confidence always teetering on the edge of arrogance. Now, he radiated restraint, a kind of humility woven into his very being. She ate in total silence, feeling as if every single bite was a surrender. He sat on the other side of the small table, not even touching the croissant he'd brought for himself, just observing her as if her every breath was monumental. It was deeply unsettling. It threw her completely off balance, and she hated the flicker of safety it sparked in her. Over the next several days, he kept showing up, always unannounced, and always bringing some small thing. The groceries she hadn't found the energy to buy, a bottle of prenatal vitamins that appeared discreetly on her counter, a collection of books she had mentioned wanting to read years ago. Each time, she swore to herself she would finally send him away, and each time, she couldn't. He never put up a fight when she told him to go. He never pressed her. He would simply stay, just long enough to see that she was all right. Then he would leave as quietly as he came, his presence lingering behind him like a quiet echo. These small, thoughtful actions unsettled her far more than any grand gesture ever could, because they were so much harder to dismiss. A week later, it was time for Ella's routine appointment. It never even occurred to her that he might be there. And yet, when she pushed open the door to the waiting room, she saw him sitting in one of the hard plastic chairs, his large frame folded forward, his hands clasped between his knees. He stood up the instant he laid eyes on her, and his gaze softened with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a tight whisper. "Yes, I should," he answered just as quietly. If you'll allow it." Before a protest could even form on her lips, the nurse called out her name, and to her utter astonishment, Xavier followed her in without a moment's hesitation, carrying himself as if he had every right to be there. The staff didn't so much as blink, likely assuming he was her husband. Perhaps it was the way his gaze lingered on her that made the conclusion feel so inevitable. Ella meant to object, but all her anger vanished the second she lay on the table. The gel was a cool shock against her skin, and then the monitor flickered to life as a tiny heartbeat filled the entire room. It was a steady, rhythmic flutter, soft yet powerful, fragile yet utterly insistent. Her vision blurred, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She felt Xavier's hand find hers, and her first instinct was to pull away. Almost. But his fingers tightened, a gentle reassurance, and she let her hand rest in his. They stayed like that in silence for a long time, held captive by the sound of the life they had brought into being. It was heartbreaking. It was breathtaking. It was both. When the appointment was over, he offered to walk her home. She said no. He fell into step beside her anyway. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the trees, creating shifting patterns of light on the pavement. They walked without speaking, enveloped by the city's hum. Finally, she was the one to break the silence. "What are you doing, Xavier?" He didn't miss a beat. "What I should have been doing all this time." She stopped abruptly, forcing him to turn and face her. "And when you get bored of this, when your family starts whispering in your ear again, when the reality of me and this baby becomes an inconvenience to your empire." Her voice broke, choked with a mixture of anger and terror. He moved closer, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Then I'll make myself remember this moment. I'll remember that heartbeat, and I'll remember you." Her breath hitched, her chest rising and falling in ragged spurts. She desperately wanted to believe him, and that was the most dangerous feeling of all. That night, Ella found herself by the crib again, staring into the half-finished nursery. Her hand drifted over the smooth edge of the wooden rail, her thoughts in turmoil. He was trying. She had to admit that. But no one knew better than her how a love that began like a wildfire could end in nothing but cold ashes. And yet, her body still remembered the feeling of safety in his arms. Her heart still remembered the man who would have done anything to make her smile. The fortress she'd built around herself was developing hairline fractures that she tried desperately to mend. But every time Xavier showed up with his quiet consideration, the walls crumbled a little more, and a part of her, the part she loathed the most, wondered if she really wanted to stop them from falling. Back in his penthouse, Xavier spent his nights with his mind completely consumed by her. He had stared down hostile boardrooms, outmaneuvered competitors, and weathered scandals without so much as flinching. But Ella could bring him to his knees. He began tearing apart his calendar, rescheduling meetings and delegating crucial tasks, freeing up time he had once considered absolutely untouchable. His empire would have to wait. She couldn't. One evening, while looking out at the glittering skyline, he admitted it aloud to the empty space. "I lost her once. I will not lose her again. Even if she never forgives me, I will prove I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't a vow of conquest. It was an act of complete surrender to love, to responsibility, and to the new life he had almost thrown away. Days later, Ella stepped outside her building to find Xavier waiting yet again. This time with no gifts or offerings, just himself. "What is it now?" she asked, her voice weary but stripped of its usual sharpness. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to walk with you." She watched him, her suspicion clear, but said nothing more. And so they walked, in silence, down the quiet street. The cool night air, a soft touch on their skin. A little ways ahead, a lone guitarist coaxed a gentle, romantic melody from his instrument. A tune that felt achingly familiar. Xavier came to a stop, his gaze locking with Ella's. "Dance with me," he murmured. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Here on the sidewalk. Why not?" A laugh escaped her in spite of herself as she shook her head. "You're ridiculous." but he was already closing the small space between them, his hand hovering near the small of her back, waiting for her permission. After a brief pause, she gave a slight nod, letting him draw her in. As the music swelled, the bustling city around them melted away. It was just the two of them, her head resting near his chest, his warm breath in her hair, their bodies moving together as if they were back in their old kitchen years ago. When the final chord faded, she pulled back abruptly, a flush creeping up her neck. "This doesn't change anything," she stated, her tone firm to conceal the tremor deep inside her. "I know," he replied, his voice soft. "But it might remind you of what could." Back inside her apartment, Ella collapsed onto her sofa. With her heart pounding, she pressed her palms to her eyes, whispering to the empty room, "Don't do this, Ella. Don't let him back in." But the warning was useless. The truth was already settled in her soul, relentless. He was in, not fully, not safely, but he was in. Just enough to rekindle the embers she thought had long turned to ash. As she drifted into a troubled sleep, a single thought pulsed through her veins, terrifying and undeniable. She still loved him. The fragile world Xavier had so carefully pieced back together started to crack on a Thursday night. He was sitting across from Ella in her simple kitchen, the quiet dinner illuminated by the warm, soft glow of a single lamp. She had granted him this much, letting him sit, eat, and simply be in her world again. It was a victory in itself. A sharp knock at the door shattered the peace. Ella froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Xavier was on his feet in an instant, his protective instincts flaring. He opened the door, and a tempest swept in. It was his mother. Cecilia Garcia breezed into the apartment like an Arctic wind, her diamond earrings flashing, her stare sharper than a shard of broken glass. His younger brother, Adrian, followed in her wake, his face a mask of tense caution. "Xavier," Cecilia said, her voice dripping with both command and astonishment. "So, it is true." Ella got to her feet slowly, her heart hammering. She felt utterly exposed in her own home, the comforting warmth of their meal instantly replaced by a bone-deep chill. Cecilia's eyes scanned the modest apartment before settling on Ella, pregnant, proud, and standing tall despite the storm of anxiety raging within her. "This," Cecilia stated, her words slow and deliberate, "is what you have been hiding." Xavier stepped between them, his posture inherently protective. "That's enough, Mother." But Cecilia paid him no mind, her voice rising with every word. "Do you have any comprehension of what you are doing our family's name, our entire reputation? Your empire will collapse if you entangle yourself with—" Her gaze flicked to Ella, loaded with poorly hidden disgust. "This." Ella felt the sting of the word, but she refused to look away. She had endured worse. "Don't," Xavier snapped, his voice colder than steel. Adrian put a cautious hand on Cecilia's arm. "Perhaps we should—" "No." Cecilia cut him off. "Xavier, your recklessness with women has always been a problem. But this is not recklessness," Xavier thundered. His chest rose and fell with furious breaths. His hands clenched into fists. This is my child. This is the woman I love, and I will not allow you to insult her in her own home. The ensuing silence was so heavy, it felt solid. Ella's breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined he would say it. Not there. Not then. Not with his family as witnesses. Love. The word was a beautiful poison echoing through her. But she couldn't ignore Cecilia's sheer fury. The cautionary look in Adrian's eyes. Or the full weight of Xavier's decision. He wasn't merely siding with her. He was waging war on the entire world that had raised him. And wars always create casualties. You need to go, Ella finally stated, her voice quiet but unshakable. It wasn't clear if she meant Cecilia or Xavier. The air in the apartment was still charged with tension, long after the door clicked shut behind his family's fading footsteps. Xavier moved toward Ella, but she refused to meet his eyes, pressing a trembling hand to her temple. You shouldn't have done that, she breathed out. I meant every syllable. He insisted. That's exactly the problem. Her gaze finally lifted to his, her eyes shimmering with tears she wouldn't let fall. Your family will never let me in. They'll never acknowledge this child. And you, her voice fractured, you will get sick of fighting them. It may not be today. It may not be tomorrow. But someday. Her words struck him like a physical blow. He closed the distance between them, framing her face with his hands and forcing her to look at him. Ella, hear me now. I have raised entire empires of steel and glass, and not a single one matters without you. If this means I have to battle them every morning for the rest of my days, I will. I am not leaving you. Not this time. Her tears finally escaped, carving hot paths down her skin. She wanted so badly to believe him. Every part of her yearned to. But trust was a shattered thing, and hers was still in a million pieces. Much later that evening, after Xavier had departed, Ella was alone in the stillness. She laid a hand on her stomach, feeling the soft, persistent flutters from within. Did you hear him? She murmured to the new life inside of her. He says he loves the both of us. He promises he's staying. She let her eyes drift shut, recalling the solid weight of his hands on her cheeks, the blaze of conviction in his voice, and for the first time in years, she let herself imagine a future, not just a plan for survival, but a world of what-ifs. Over at his penthouse, Xavier was confronting his brother. You caused quite a spectacle, Adrian noted quietly. They gave me no choice. Xavier countered. They're not wrong about the price you'll pay, Adrian warned. The board, the shareholders, they will use this as ammunition against you. Then let them try. Adrian heaved a sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. You're actually prepared to lose everything. Xavier's reply was instantaneous. I would rather lose it all than ever lose her again. The following days were thick with tension. Cecilia's disapproval was a storm cloud on the horizon, and murmurs were already snaking through the powerful circles Xavier once so easily dominated. But he never wavered. On the contrary, he just kept showing up. He escorted Ella to her doctor's appointments. He repaired the endlessly dripping faucet in her kitchen. He sat and read novels aloud to her when her back hurt too much and she couldn't find sleep. Each act was small on its own, but together they were weaving something delicate yet strong between them. Ella tried to keep her guard up, But even the highest walls eventually crumble under a steady, gentle siege. One evening, curled up together on her couch, the baby gave a sudden kick. Her eyes widened as her hand flew to her belly. Xavier's own hand instinctively covered hers, his palm a warm weight on her skin. The baby kicked once more, and in that single moment, as Ella witnessed the raw, unguarded delight on his face, she saw the tears start to form in his eyes, a sincerity in his gaze that chipped away at her resolve. Still, fear was a ghost that haunted her, whispering in the dead of night, resurrecting the memory of promises that had turned to dust. But a fragile, stubborn hope was beginning to bloom alongside it. She found herself studying him in unguarded moments, the easy way he hauled in the groceries, the focus as he pieced together the crib, the unconscious smile that spread across his face when he heard the baby's heartbeat. She despised the fact that her heart still belonged to him. She despised the terrifying idea that love could actually be enough. And it's right here, my friends, that the tide of their personal storm finally starts to turn. Because, as we all know, love is anything but easy. It's constantly challenged, bruised, and put through the ringer by the world around us. Xavier has put his heart on the line, betting everything he has. Meanwhile, Ella is teetering on the precipice of trust, her soul caught somewhere between terror and acceptance. Their story is a long way from being finished, but maybe, just like them, you've experienced the draw of a love that felt impossible, that painful wish to believe again, even when your history screams at you to run. If their journey has struck a chord with you, if you have ever yearned, ever hoped, or ever gone to battle for love, then add your voice to the chorus. Drop your own stories in the comments. Let's make your experience part of this tale, and be sure to follow, because the very next move they make, the next decision, just might be the one that redefines everything.